Welcome to ASM Connected, the podcast brought to you by ASM Technologies. Across the series, we explore the emerging trends in tech and meet key speakers, futurists and business leaders from across the globe. In this episode, ASM Technologies' Iain Tomkinson talks through the world of defence and intelligence sectors with guests Geoff Nicholls MBE and Nick Melgaard. Geoff is a former platoon commander and officer with the British Army, and following a position with NATO, now works for tech company Primer with a specialised interest in cyber and defence. Geoff helps support government and organisations to realise and adopt the power of artificial intelligence. Nick is also a former infantry officer in the British Army, specialising in information operation and intelligence. Nick holds degrees in philosophy and international relations and has worked for Primer since they launched in the UK, developing commercial strategies and helping government departments integrate AI for positive change. In this episode, we'll hear about the latest tech capabilities of the military, how AI and better tech can help bring peace, how tech companies are working with military forces around the world, and how the defence industry of tomorrow could look. All of that to come on ASM Connected.
Hi everybody and welcome to ASM Connected. We've got some exciting guests for you today. Very different subject than we've covered off before. But first, let me introduce you to Geoff to start off with. Hi, Geoff.
Hi, Iain. How are you today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Very good. Also have Nick with me. Morning, Nick.
Morning, Iain.
So, gents, a lot of experience on both the military and AI and natural language technology, which is going to be great. So just to set us off, we'll start with a question that is hopefully a shortish answer, but one that I'm quite keen to understand. And we've, over the years, worked with a lot of cyber companies, security companies that have come out of Israel. It seems to be the hotbed of technology, particularly in cyber. And I suppose it's well documented that the military in Israel is fantastic at developing cyber technologies and applications. Question to you, chaps, is the British military on par with the Israelis, or is it being more conservative about its abilities, which is a traditionally British thing to be? How do we compare, and is it even possible to do so?
I think I'll take that for us if that's all right, Iain.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Geoff.
Thanks. It's definitely one of my favourite areas to debate around, what is cyber and what are the subsets of it and what do we actually mean by it? It's a really fascinating space I've been working in since about 2016 with the military. And ironically, it wasn't that long ago that the UK or, the United Kingdom didn't really acknowledge that it had an offensive cyber capability. It's only in the recent sort of 5 or 6 years that it acknowledged that this sort of capability even exists. And I think cyber technologies is really hard to compare because it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. You don't really know what's below it. And as you said, rightly so, like very conservative approach, I feel, particularly UK government and British Army plays in that space. So I think it would be hard to compare directly, who's got the better one. Naturally, I'd always say, United Kingdom, being an ex-British Army officer. But I think it's almost like trying to compare sort of, apples and pears when it comes to it. And one thing I'd like to probably explore in this would be, perhaps it's like, is defense in this instance, like the British military, is it sort of keeping up, with emerging technologies, which allows it to be comparable to things like Israel in this instance? And I think historically, defense has been quite bad at keeping up to speed with technology, particularly the last sort of like 2 decades, where we're starting to see a change in that now. And I think we can leverage, as the United Kingdom, things like our relationships with either Five Eyes communities, so USA, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which is quite a unique relationship that specializes in things like cyber capabilities, as well as leveraging things like, NATO allies or agencies as well that can support us going forward. So if I personally don't think defense has kept up in the past in the commercial sectors with tech and innovation, defense doesn't really own the monopoly anymore on innovation. And it's almost like there's been an inverse in recent history where defense is now behind the commercial sector. So we have to provide integrators and spaces where we as defense, they can connect with commercial sectors and allow contractors or government suppliers to perhaps develop bespoke solutions for very unique requirements for defense. So for example, Incutel being a sort of a VC-backed venture that supports national security aspects in the United States, something that we're connected to. They're after getting the best bits of technology and connect it along. Or for example, NATO's introduced this year a thing called Diana, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. And the UK, again, May this year, has developed the Defence Battle Lab. And the purpose of these organizations is to be that interface, the sort of the WeWork culture or the innovation space and leveraging commercial sectors to bring to defense the latest bits of tech. And I'm sure we'll unpack, cyber and AI a little bit later, but I think it really does apply to things where the military's been behind in, particularly around, the law of diffusion of innovation, where I found the military's been quite a late adopter in particular technologies. And, I see our role as commercial sectors to try and get defense, particularly British military and the UK government, towards being like an early adopter of certain technologies as we go forward.
So just to, I suppose, expand on that, there's quite a firm line between the government defence. It's all highly secure and secretive, and a commercial organisation which behaves in a very different way. How receptive these days is the defence sector to commercial organisations knocking on the door and saying, hey, I've got this great piece of tech, how can we work together? How does that work these days? Is there a positive reception to that?
Yeah, I think so. And experience with Primary at the minute is we've had some really positive connections with the government, and they're very open. I think you're right to highlight things like, there's security classifications, et cetera, and information that commercial companies just aren't going to be privy to. But there's kind of this relationship that you can form where it's mutually beneficial. We'll have access to new bits of perhaps data that we've never seen before, or unique problem sets that we hadn't thought about, and therefore we can apply solutions. And it becomes this reciprocal relationship as we go through to it. But they do have these, these sort of nodes, I'm going to call them, where they open their doors. Defense opens the doors to commercial clients, and they want us to come in and engage with them and speak to them and explain, technologies and solutions. And I was saying that the funniest thing is, if you ask someone in the British military, and I classify myself in that, if you asked me 10 years ago, what do you think was a really good online collaboration tool? The answer would be, Microsoft Teams, because that's the only answer we ever knew. And it takes time to unpack and explore and talk to different organizations to actually find, well, actually, there's a plethora of solutions you could use. And I think that's the thing that defense today is really open to, is exploring and going on a journey together.
That's reassuring, that is. And particularly, as you say, sort of probably 5-10 years ago, I think that sort of approach to emerging tech and innovation was probably similar to that in the enterprise space as well. It was, well, we've got our Cisco, we've got Microsoft, what else do we need? I think the attitudes have changed. Well, if we want to stay ahead, not only in the enterprise space, but also in defense, and if we want to keep ahead of the competitors out there, be them commercial competition or if they're the bad guys, I think we need to stay ahead. And I think that's driving that sort of receptiveness towards technology.
The final point on that would just be, I think they've had that big, almost like paradigm shift effectively, where, we spend a lot of time fighting in particular regions of the world. We were very, very concentrated on the physical battle, the physical domain or the land domain. And it's only in the last perhaps, 6-7 years where that switch has come back to cyber being a priority. And it's nice to see.
So moving on to some of the more sort of in-depth questions, and this is, I suppose, an opener. So we're all aware that technology is disrupting all sectors and even our way of life. Every sort of sector and every sector we've covered in the podcast series, everyone's saying, yeah, this is the impact. Obviously, defence is very different. What impact is innovative and emerging tech having on the battlefield of today and the future? And you've obviously given us a little bit of a glimpse there that it is having an impact, and we've moved from, I suppose, boots on the ground, which is obviously still important. But how is it impacting defence for the future?
Yeah, I'll come in with I think a couple of points, if that's all right. I mean, I think the point that, technology is disrupting all sectors is quite well observed, and Primer is part of something that's going on in a lot of different respects throughout the technology and machine learning world. Essentially, what we're trying to do is, engineer things from the other direction. So what I mean by that is, usually if you would have a very complicated process, let's say teaching a robot to walk, you would have to tell it to put its right leg forward and then rotate its hip by 30 degrees. And you would have to come up with a very, very complicated set of instructions from the ground up. What machine learning is doing is basically saying, okay, what do I want to see? And labeling some examples of success, or the thing that I'm trying to pick out. And then letting a complicated, neural network figure out, okay, well, what do all of those instances of success have in common? And then extract the rules from that and then reapply them. So in a way, it's kind of building from the other direction. And that's a huge change that Primer is part of in language technology, but also in computer vision and many other areas of machine learning and data science. A couple of years ago, there was this huge explosion in machine learning models for language AI, which is the area that we're in. But the impact it's having is several fold. Fundamentally, technology is about reducing the friction. I'm sure Geoff, who attended staff college, I never did, but Geoff would have a lot more to say about the Carl von Clausewitz and talking about friction in the battlefield. Basically, how many barriers are there to manifesting your intent? Can you remove? What's the noise or the difficulties in doing the thing that you want to do? And so fundamentally, technology is created to help us do the things that we want to do with fewer complications. Be that physical technology or software. What's kind of ironic and very interesting, and I guess the subject for this discussion, is that it's reduced a lot of friction. And so now, we can look up information on the internet very easily. We can pilot more or less autonomous weapons, without having to have someone in the cockpit. We can, shoot a little bit further. We can have smarter weapons. But with all of those technological advances that help us reduce friction, we're also creating problems or complications in other areas. The massive amount of information that we now have at our disposal, the fact that certain very, very effective smart weapons have pushed people off the battlefield, which has changed the shape of armed conflict. That's the kind of irony. So it's had a huge positive impact, generally emerging technology, but it's also created some very new complications that, companies like Primer and in partnership with the armed forces are trying to address.
Yeah, that's a really interesting play on it. And, particularly with everything that's going on in the world at the moment, particularly with the Ukraine conflict, seeing that the Russian forces have actually been pinpointing and getting data on the Ukrainian forces' mobile phones because they've left them switched on, and they're using that to pinpoint people. And that all generates data, be it movement data, how many people are out there. So effectively, can AI help minimize civilian casualties, improve target recognition and reaction times? And I know there's lots of cases where reaction times is quite critical, and I think that's one thing that I'm aware of, that technology has improved significantly. But coming back to, can it help minimize civilian casualties? Can it improve target recognition? Because there's been some terrible events over the years where what is defined sometimes by the military as collateral damage is high. Do you think that we can use technology to improve that?
I mean, yes, absolutely. And I'll pass over to Geoff, who'll have much better detail on some of the aspects of this. But yes, absolutely. And in many respects, that's the intention of using technology in this area is to try and manifest some of the rules and ideas, and to try and minimize collateral damage. And I think the example that comes to mind is the Gulf War. The Soviet Union was disintegrating. And the West was trying to use new weapons and to sort of showcase the way that technology can be used in war. And this trend has increased, and now we're looking at, the use of machine learning, in particular computer vision. A couple of technologies are really, really pioneering this. One American company, Athena Technologies, comes to mind, which is looking for particular patterns and looking for, really, really interesting, sophisticated patterns about, who's carrying what sorts of weapons. But then also for non-kinetic measures, like information technology, absolutely as well. And operations centers, fire service, police, in all areas, military and also just emergency services, the triaging and organization of information, especially unstructured written information, is a huge step. Primer has a couple of products around this, in particular the release of Primer Command last year, but essentially this is about closing the OODA loop, which is, a fancy way of saying that we're trying to make decisions faster than our adversaries. But I think there is, a significant difference, that the Gulf War was very significant. I think I'm quoting Max Brooks of the Modern War Institute saying that, the Gulf War was in some ways the worst war that the West ever fought. It was designed to deter aggression. America will destroy enemies on the battlefield, but the message was, well, don't fight on the battlefield. And so in a way, very, very sophisticated weapons and technology has changed what war looks like. Now war involves many more civilians because the lines between civilian and combatant and battlefield have blurred. So the weapons are becoming much more sophisticated. It doesn't necessarily mean that sophistication is being used for good either. Weapons themselves and AI systems, they don't have intention. So it's important to figure out what we want to use these measures for. And whilst there's, the ability to process a lot of information, there's also a lot more information out there. So I think the technology has had, a double-edged sword, to use the sort of weapon pun. And it changes things very significantly. I think it's very important still to be engaged in the discussion of the way we work with technology. And I think it's essential to not just let the technology take over. Primer operationalizes NLP. That's a big part of what we do. We don't just create products or the research, but we also, try to get it into difficult places and to work on significant problems. And we need to continually think about what we want to do. Geoff, what are your thoughts on this sort of thing?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think Nick makes a really great point in there, and we'd be bad off ex-army officers, wouldn't we, if we didn't talk about classics? And I think the interesting thing you picked on there, Nick, is the nature of the war doesn't change; the character does. And Iain, you mentioned this about the complexities we're seeing today in Ukraine with aerial systems, targeting, etc. And I think the challenge or the benefits we're facing now with artificial intelligence in this is really the understanding of things like, phase zero operations. So before the bang occurs in a war, do we understand adversaries, where they are, locations, so we can try and perhaps get upstream of a conflict in the first instance? And it kind of relates to like a kill chain, and Nick alluded to this. If you don't want a soldier to be injured, well, the solution is don't send them to the theatre of war in the first instance and they won't get hurt. But if you have to send your soldier, make sure that they can't be seen. And if they can be seen, make sure they can't be targeted. And if they can be targeted, make sure they can't be hit. And if they can be hit, make sure that they survive. And this sort of chain, it reminds me of where we're facing now with artificial intelligence. It's like we could perhaps pull these things back using artificial intelligence or technologies to help, and I use the term loosely, like sustainable aspects of wars where we find ourselves facing. And I think that supports perhaps like the civilian aspect of this. It's whenever there's a war, there's always other casualties that aren't the soldiers fighting, unfortunately, as well. But I think the bit that becomes even more powerful is that OODA loop, the observe, orientate, decide, and act. Using things that support human-machine teaming, which, the Ministry of Defence has a joint note on, for example, about almost like enhancing people or soldiers up the sort of artificial intelligence food chain, allows us to do the things that we're good at as humans, making informed decisions based on the information that's presented rather than trying to scrabble around or try and fight for that information. I think that's where technology can help us. It could present us with the information at a relevant time so we can make, informed decisions, which means we'll have a faster OODA loop cycle and therefore likely to have, a higher target success rate. And also, therefore, like quicker reaction times, either in the conflict or, as I said earlier, with sort of the build-up and understanding warfare in phase zero, that reaction time to that crisis. If you can use technology to perhaps have early indicators and warnings that a conflict is starting to flare up, you might be able to sort of, nip it in the bud and therefore save issues, casualties, costs, etc. downstream once that war goes what I'd call loud.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And I think, the use of AI in defence, that's where it does have a significant impact. And it's the same, I suppose, in the enterprise. It's about surfacing that data and making sense of what's there and presenting it to you quickly so that, as you say, humans can do what humans are good at. So that makes perfect sense. And I've read tons of stuff about cases where AI has saved civilian lives from things like car bombs, where certain trends have been spotted and it kind of red flagged it. And it's like, well, yeah, there's some traffic patterns, for example. I remember specifically looking at one, and I think it was in Afghanistan, where that they were looking at the traffic patterns, and they realised, and then the AI picked up on the fact that 2 hours before a car bomb, the traffic subsided in the area. And they realised that this subsidence in the traffic was because the locals were putting it out, saying, look, there's going to be a car bomb, keep your family indoors because we don't want any of our own sort of becoming collateral damage as such. And it turned out that was the case. And they actually managed to actually use that to their advantage and not only deal with the car bomb before it went off, but they also realised that when they were taking people to court, that there was the same there was probably going to be an attack, and they could actually time it right to get people to court and back safely without any sort of impact. And I thought that was a great use of artificial intelligence of just looking at traffic patterns to completely solve something else that is not necessarily related, but is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I definitely came across if not the same system, a very similar system that was very good at detecting abnormal behavior. So we'd plot things, and I think it links into like automation of tasks. So this is something perhaps, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that you would have had an intelligence analyst sat there with a piece of paper, working out what happens on a Monday morning, Tuesday morning, so on and so forth, and using sort of their own experience and training to deduce logical outcomes. But I think the real power here that you're mentioning or alluding towards is that, the automation that comes in from simple tasks that we used to do as an individual can just be speeded up or automated and compress that data. Like when you think of Afghanistan, we're there for just under 2 decades. That's a lot of information. And when people are deployed to those regions like Nick and I, you only really do sort of 6-ish months at a time. And there's always a period of one when you arrive of like making sense of the information before you become perhaps really operational. You probably then have a good sort of 4 months of being effective. And then you kind of have a month there where you hand over, where the continuity that is provided by having things like automation or artificial intelligence means perhaps we can have a more considered approach and consistent approach in that warfare. And like you said there, actually over time, start to save lives because we start to get ahead of the bang moment. And that's what I was sort of alluding to in the first instance. The more we understand in a passive space, the better we are at predicting things, perhaps that might or might not occur with degrees of predictability, but we may then be able to stop things occurring in the first instance that have second and third order effects like, soldiers aren't targeted, therefore there's no civilian casualties, and then there's no infrastructure damage to the local community, which means people can carry on shopping as they would do and having a thriving community.
Yeah, that's great use of technology. And, if we can all preserve those key elements of life effectively, then that's a definite benefit. And I suppose moving slightly off AI for a moment, I suppose other technologies that, I'm fascinated by and are starting to see more and more. And I know we did touch on this when you came in to see us a few weeks ago. VR and XR, imagine is having a huge impact on the battlefield simulation and preparation for battles and that setup. Have you seen any examples of that at all that you can talk about, obviously?
That's always the caveat.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting as well, simulation isn't new to the military. We do things like rehearsal of concepts and we practice constantly because unless you're at war or a conflict, you're always in a stage of preparation. And I've seen the varying types over the years, using computers to assist in targeting helicopters, etc., and bringing those to life on the battlefield, as well as doing things like board games or mapping situations out. But yeah, to answer the real cookie question, I've seen some pretty interesting things recently to do with rehearsal of missions before you actually arrive in the area. So they've used things like drone imagery, etc., or open source information to collate this particular one I saw was like a target compound or infrastructure that they were going to, a strike team was going to go and hit. And whilst on the boat or ship in preparation for the mission, they had a VR headset set up on them, and they effectively built out the compound they were going to strike in the hangar of the aircraft. And they used VR to go through room by room and practice those drills. So then they kind of had that, that muscle memory or motor functions embedded. By the time they got onto the target, they would then have that muscle memory in place in order to have a more successful outcome of that mission. But Nick, I don't know if you've seen some other bits as well.
Yeah, I know that we have the UK's new Battle Lab in Dorset, and large simulation companies. I mean, Improbable springs to mind, but there are certainly others that are designed to help organisations work together and to rehearse. And I like Geoff, good old infantry mindset is rehearsals, and drilling is absolutely essential. And the simulation, VR and XR is a huge part of that. I mean, I don't think it's a substitute for physical training. I don't think anyone's pretending that it is, but physical training with live ammunition is still something that the British Army does very, very well and takes rightly a huge amount of pride in. But I think that my 2 cents on the use of VR and XR, Iain, is, again, that the technology is never going to replace human beings. The use of information-based technologies like Primer or VR or XR is never going to be a substitute for interaction with the physical world or a human being. But human beings using that technology will inevitably replace, the human beings that are not. So whilst the technology is never going to replace people, people who are using that technology will have an edge. And, VR and XR is just a really, really interesting and exciting development. There was a Dan Carlin war experience, wasn't there, Geoff? I mean, I think he was talking about it on a podcast where they were trying to recreate, the sort of trench experience and, started giving people, very uncomfortable flashbacks. So yeah, I think it's becoming scarily realistic now, but I don't think, it can ever be a substitute, and nor should it be used as a substitute. It's part of a larger way of, working together and rehearsing.
There's definitely a thought I had on that, just expanding on Nick's point, is there's also like another so what moment, like, and Nick's right to say we're never going to replace, there's never been that substitute for the real life training, because it's, Nick and I have been through that, it's a whole different world. But perhaps there's also this aspect of simulated training in the future, but not just the physical component, but also simulating using artificial intelligence technologies, either because it's a risk to mission because we don't want it to be compromised, typically around things like offensive cyber capabilities, or whether that's just new and emerging technologies that are very costly and we want to prototype something in the first instance to make sure it works. Could also be another way to have a good play on simulating interaction with new technologies.
Absolutely, and I suppose from my understanding, if the VR world and the real world and that sort of trench experience, the smells and the weather and all those different elements that come into play in any sort of experience, and the smell of the cordite in the air and all those things, I think we're a long way off trying to replicate that. And I think they're the things that you can't prepare people for in that sort of in that virtual world yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think there's still more to come, but I do think those the case where you used of the muscle memory, practicing those drills, I think that's a great case for it. I think we'll probably see more of that in all sectors moving forward, that practice. And we've spoken to a lot of people in the education sector, in medical sector, and a lot of the good purposes that we can use this technology for are preparing people as best as we can, but it doesn't put you into that sort of real life pressure situation, because at the end of the day, you do kind of know it's not real.
Absolutely.
I suppose bringing in the subject of data science, your expertise, and I'm kind of interested how data science coupled with AI, what role that can play in today's military and intelligence in particular, because data science is a very different beast than AI, unless you tell me otherwise.
I think the efficacy in war piece, like measurement of effect, as we used to call it in the information space, we've been talking about metrics in war for a long time. Vietnam metrics, that famously counting success by a body count was a catastrophic, measurement of success. So I think the idea of data science is only as good as the data that you're choosing to collect, and the figuring out what are the metrics of success is a huge part of that. And so that the ability to process data will only ever be as good as the sort of data that you think is relevant for what you're ultimately trying to achieve. What do you make of this, Geoff?
Yeah, I think so. I think Nick and I have both been in that situation where you need this, right? This artificial intelligence, and we'll come into the data science aspect in a moment. Pursuing this is non-negotiable. Like you have to have this now. The cat's out of the box type moments for us, because, we as humans literally just don't have the capacity with the amount of data that's available today. And I know there's subsets that we'll be interested in for intelligence, for example, but the pace at what that's being produced and the scale is just at a level where we're never going to be able to process that as an individual. And take that Afghan, scenario a minute ago. Who's going to look at 20 years worth of, IED plotting information and make sense of it in a timely manner? We're going to need the computers to assist us to sift through this and make sense of it. And I think that's what we're really facing today. And I was doing some reading a few weeks ago around the amounts of data that we have available today. I think it was something like in 2018, there's 33 zettabytes worth of data. And that global sphere of all data is going to be roughly about 175 zettabytes by 2025. Like, we're just not going to be able to do that as individuals. So therefore, we're going to have to use these data science and artificial intelligence principles to actually assist us. And I think what they do bring are things like natural language processing or predictive analysis, or, in other terms, like data-based classification models or rule engines, deep neural networks, and making sense of all this. And Nick does a great thing about, bringing the needle in the haystack to life, but you kind of need to know what the needle is in the first instance. We've got to sift through that. And I really do believe that, the winner of like an AI race, I think we're in an AI race. I really do believe that, the space race still exists, but we're also concurrently running an AI race. And it won't be perhaps the people who are the first ones to develop it, because everyone's doing that and everyone's got their doors open to commercial technologies, or even who has the best technology. I genuinely believe the field here of what it plays and what data science and AI brings is the person who wins that race will be the ones who figure out how to make best use of it. And I think that's probably going to be the big challenge that we face today in the intelligence communities, because we can do a lot. And Nick touches upon things like ethics and laws, etc. But it's how we best utilize that who's going to win. Because I think it's a pretty even field, perhaps. Even go back to your first question about Israel and the UK today. I really do think it's about who best uses it in the near future is probably going to win that AI race.
Great. That's great response there. Thanks for that. And I suppose following on from the point that you touched on there, which is a huge topic, and we could probably spend all afternoon debating it. I know it's Nick is particularly passionate around, which is the ethics of or AI and data science, something that we discuss internally here at ASM on a regular basis. Is there an ethical line that shouldn't be crossed when it comes to utilising AI and machine learning and in other technologies in warfare?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, as you say, there's a lot to say, and I promise I won't drag us down a massive rabbit hole. But I think there is, the single point that I would make is, why is it okay to do things in war that it's not otherwise okay to do? You wouldn't shoot someone, just walking down the street, or at least that would be, a illegal and very immoral thing to do. And so how do we justify exercising violence or aggression in war? And it's this, it's a very, very strange moral category that war fits into. Ultimately, we fight for peace. And that's a very, very strange thing to do. We drinking for temperance, do this thing more, exercise violence, because doing it more means that it will happen less. So fighting for peace is a very, very strange form of kind of bizarre moral gymnastics. And so like traditional war, what we would call the just war theory, which is, one collection of historical theories around justifying behavior in war, is arranged around this very, very strange thing that belongs all and only to the category of war, fighting for peace, a very, very strange thing to do. But basically, there is an element here which we can apply to the use of technology, AI, and cyber, which is, we can fight for peace. And basically, the rule is, or the line that shouldn't be crossed is, well, war is bad. And so we should try and get out of situations of war, and we should try and fight our way out of situations of war. Now, that might sound a little bit like digging yourself out of a hole, but basically the rule that you should follow is don't do anything in war that would jeopardize the possibility of a lasting, meaningful peace after that. So even when you're doing things that you shouldn't be doing, there are still rules. And that's an intuitive idea. Even if you drive your car without a license, you can still break the speed limit. So even if you are doing things that are, otherwise not okay, exercising in violence, don't cross the line that you do things that are going to extend that period of violence. And so we can apply this to AI and machine learning. So don't launch information campaigns that manipulate the truth and undermine trust between parties that make peace more difficult after the war. Don't do anything using technology that brings in people into the war that wouldn't otherwise be involved in war. So don't use technology to extend the boundaries of war, both in space or time. I think that's the kind of, if you can sum it up in one kind of moral line, Iain, that's the line, is that fundamentally technology, don't do anything or don't use technology for anything that would extend the limits of war or that would limit the possibility of peace. I mean, I think that the other point that I would make, and I think Geoff's probably got a very interesting perspective here based on his experience in cyber, is that there's this huge change going on in the philosophy, in the technology of language, where after thousands and thousands of years of like the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind, And now what's going on is that like that's being manifested in the technology. And so we have people like Emily Bender publishing articles last year about philosophical thought experiments that are now becoming a practical reality, that basically we have machines that can pass the Turing test, but they can't think, they can't exercise judgment, but they can make a very, very good show of it. And I think that comes to the sort of last point, is that finally, after thousands and thousands of years of philosophy of language, we are now starting to kind of manifest philosophy of language in tech. We shouldn't be asking machines to do too much. Machines and AI can scale processes and scale things that we teach them how to do, but they don't have agency. They can't exercise judgment. So it can't take responsibility. The kind of additional, more general, I guess, rule is that, AI shouldn't be asked to do too much. There should always be a human being making decisions and taking responsibility, and the moral buck can't stop with AI or stop with the machine. There has to be a person there who uses AI so that they can make better decisions. We shouldn't outsource those decisions completely to AI. What are your thoughts here, Geoff?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating stuff there, Nick. I'm going to come at it from, I think, more of like a legal policy side, if I may, because I think all that thinking is done at a very high level for us and is implemented, and it kind of manifests itself as the laws. You touched upon some today. So maybe thinking of like, not even going to bridge the non-lethal capabilities, I suppose, but just from just a data collection point of view, we have laws in place, and I clearly support that we should never break those laws. But as Nick alluded to, no one will walk down the street and shoot someone. It's not allowed, but it is allowed if you're a police officer and there's an imminent threat. So there's always the caveats to the law, which are still lawful acts, but they allow us to break laws. So things, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 8, everyone has a right to their private and family life, and the respect to that for their correspondence as well. In times when there are people who are threatening our national security, the state with its powers will have the ability to breach things like ECAHR Article 8 in order to collect information. So there's a really interesting dynamic, because we have laws which apply to the population, so we're all in accordance with it. And then there's times where things have to perhaps be broken in order to protect the wider populations when it comes to it as well. So I think it's really interesting. But here's my point. There's a law that should not be broken, and there's policies. Policies are implemented, particularly in defense, in order to ensure that we do not breach the law, because we don't want to do that. And the policies allow us then to navigate internally to make sure that we've got, balance and checks in place for compliance. But my problem I experienced was that we are over safe in so many aspects, particularly in technologies, because it's new and emerging. We're very comfortable when, as you said, Iain, boots on the ground with a rifle, much easier to make a decision. But our policies today for technology are so far removed from the law that they're over safe. And I think it inhibits our ability to operate in the cyber domain effectively. You compare, we talked about Ukraine earlier, Russia, absolute ability to have freedom of movement in the cyber domain without any consequence. And they do not hold themselves to our moral high ground, and nor should we go down to them. But, we've got to be realistic to perhaps the challenges we face in this by having, the laws and legalities in place, and the frictions in war that will create us, particularly in that cyber domain.
Yeah, that's a fascinating overview. And I suppose one of the things that we're coming across is that the rules and the laws out there do not evolve fast enough for emerging technologies, which is blatantly obvious and quite often hampers progress as well, not just on the battlefield, but in the likes of medicine and different spaces, unless everybody gets behind it and focuses on it. Just, I suppose, starting to wrap up and wind down a little bit. My last sort of big question for you is, one of the things that I've seen is that the size of the AI market for military use is expected to reach around $19 billion by 2025. And that's just purely the AI sector, which is a huge number for that. What tips would you give to anyone looking to explore AI solutions with their customers?
I suppose give us a call, Iain. I guess there's this standoff that we often face, that Geoff and I have come across, which is, the what do you have, what do you want? Language AI, natural language processing is very new. And, it's also a fundamentally very, very disruptive technology. And so I suppose the tip would be to try and be more accepting of benign use cases and data sets as a stepping stone towards something that really, really, is significant later on. And I think in the defense and government world, there's a lot of process, as well there should be if it's public money, of course. But, we feel a lot of pressure to get everything right 100% of the time. And that is, completely understandable. But like over time, that makes the processes quite slow. And I would suggest that, where we've had success in the past, we've used AI, language AI in this case, for relatively like benign use cases and data sets, for things that are maybe not that sensitive, just to prove the concept. And we can do that relatively quickly if we can see the data and, we're relatively comfortable working together. It's going straight from 0, to 0 to 60 to working in difficult environments with really challenging data. Getting that right, by the time you've gone through the process of the permissions and getting that into a place where it's viable, the technology is nearly always out of date. And so being able to move quickly and use technology in kind of benign use cases, I think, is a really, really positive step that we've seen. What do you think, Geoff?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think for me, I would suggest, going back to what I mentioned earlier, the diffusion of innovation. If you've got that bell curve, and on the left-hand side of that bell curve, if you can imagine it, you've got the early adopters and the innovators, and on the right-hand side, the late adopters. And there's that little moment where everyone else will join the journey. I think when you're in a field like we are in natural language processing, it really is an emerging capability. It's really taken off since sort of 2018, 2019, so right in those early stages. Just remember that not everyone is ready for that journey, perhaps, and that it's going to take time. And things like this, where we do thought leadership, and we're talking about, the art of the possible, it's about working where those people are who are going to be supporters or amplifiers of that technology, and perhaps spending more time with them and focusing in, because those are the ones you're going to have more success with. And I say that because, when we deal with things like governments or militaries, they have very long procurement cycles, and people tend to change jobs quite regularly as well. So it's important to be in front of the right person, sometimes at the right time, in order to have that longevity. And it will take a long time to perhaps develop the things like Nick was touching on there. It can take 12 or 18 months to have success with certain clients. And I suppose my last point in that would be, perhaps some things we're learning more recently is, sometimes you don't need to have the 100% solution, particularly with early adoption. You just need to have that proof of concept that shows perhaps 30, 40% viability, that gets enough generation for the next turn of the handle, for the next iteration, for the next development of the capability.
Great, that's great advice. And patience is definitely a virtue with dealing with the large, complex organisations that you're sharing. A couple of quick fire questions from you, and just as a bit of a wind down. First one, I'll put this to Nick. Actually, do you play Call of Duty on the Xbox or PlayStation?
I have been known to log in for a couple of games here and there. Younger days. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely having spent a couple of months at Brecon, it does take the glamour off in a little bit. But no, I think, definitely younger, playing soldiers. Not so much since I left the army, actually. But maybe a little bit more since then. Yeah.
I can imagine that being on the side of a Brecon Beacons on a cold January day is very different to sitting in your living room on Call.
A little bit, yeah. And I think it's actually quite nice to be able to do that sitting in a living room. But yeah, definitely, I think the training and just the amount of time getting rained on and being outside does sort of take the glamour away from those games.
I do think, though, a valid point, and I suppose I can see, obviously there's a lot of ex-pilots at the moment that are drone pilots and have got experience of that, but there is probably going to be a time when people who've worked in that sort of virtual world can fly drones and have a role to play in the battlefield.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be, and I think the discussion around autonomous weapon systems and drones is a fascinating one, and no doubt people who have skill in gaming are going to be able to turn that to real life situations. So yeah, I mean, I think for I guess my and Geoff generation and the era of the military that we're in, it maybe wasn't quite as applicable. But yeah, I guess it's really interesting to see how the skills used in gaming, piloting vehicles on simulations are becoming incredibly transferable.
Okay. No, great, thanks. And my last question for you today. We'll go with Geoff on this one. In fact, I know to both of you. So what's your favourite tech gadget?
Yeah, I'll start with that then. So I think I'm going to go a high level. My favorite tech gadget is actually pretty much anything Apple based, but specifically the sort of home assistant stuff I've been involved in recently with, Siri. No plug here at all. But I'm really a big fan of that human machine teaming aspect of making my life easier. There's lots of things you can automate in your home, whether that's going to be like, basic things like alarms or having lights come on and off at certain times, whether that's going to be, digitizing your shopping list, which is a very helpful habit I find at the minute. And just having, just that connectivity, I find it really interesting. As Nick said, spending the decade living in the field, being pretty wet and miserable, it's nice to have some luxuries around that make your life a bit easier, perhaps. So I'm a massive fan of that. And I think for me, security is always important. And, if you're online, you're doing stuff, you're never going to be 100% secure. But I feel like, for me, Apple's a good level of security, hence why I sort of focus on them. But yeah, if you've not been involved in that smart home yet, I'd definitely recommend it. Makes your life a little bit easier. And it's quite fun if you're into coding and stuff, you can really get into like custom automation pieces and make some pretty cool things. I did one recently where you can, you ask Siri, find me all the local pizza places, and it does a little bit of code in the background and it presents you the top 10 pizza places based on rating and location.
Oh, very good. And Nick?
I think I like these videos coming out recently about the DJI Mavic Mini drone, I think with the Oculus. So like the VR headset, you can pair now to the camera on a small drone and then fly the drone and then look down or, either fly the drone and be kind of flying around as if looking through the Oculus, seeing the camera on the drone, which I think would be awesome. And then you can then turn it back on yourself and have this bizarre out of body experience where you're looking back on yourself with the Oculus, where you're watching the camera from the drone that's showing you the footage of you down below on the ground. I just thought that'd be a really cool experience. And I just think it's a really, really interesting use of technology to have experiences and to see and do things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Yeah, what amazes me with that kind of technology is, and I've got kids of a generation that are into Snapchat, and I saw something recently where Snapchat had brought out a drone that can sit in the palm of your hand and follow you around, have different modes and all that. I saw the technology and thought that's quite cool, actually. And I was thinking I can see what they're doing there to keep ahead of Instagram and all that. I could actually see why they were doing it. And I guess they must be doing it as a loss leader because the price point was something like $299. And I was just like, wow, how much cheaper is this really cool technology coming to be? And it's fascinating, but it's some great stuff out there, particularly if you're into your gadgets and technology like I certainly am anyway. Conscious of time, so thank you very much for your time today, guys. Really great to speak to you again. Absolutely enjoyed that content. Really exciting stuff going on out there. Hopefully all for the right reasons as well, which is one of the things that we want to see is peace and also and make sure less people come into harm's way. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you both very much for your time. And we'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Iain.
Cheers, guys.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to ASM Connected, the podcast from ASM Technologies, with special guests Nick Melgaard and Geoff Nicholls MBE. To find out more about the team at ASM Technologies or about anything discussed in the podcast, visit asmtech.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe now to make sure you never miss an update. And check out the other episodes in the series, featuring key speakers, futurists and business leaders from across the globe. Just search on your podcast app for ASM Connected.